Hello everyone, so my name is Gustav Razner and this is just a video that I'm making with regards to the DECA competition that we see ahead of us in just a week, districts, and hopefully this can also be helpful for you regarding states and maybe even internationals and AAM this year. So first of all, I would just like to start off by giving a bit of background about myself with regards to the classes that I've taken and their connection to DECA. I've taken Mrs. Forrester's IB Business 1 and IB Business 2, and I found that those are incredibly helpful, really. But that's really all I've done, and as a result, I did start DECA my 11th year or junior year, and then this is, so I'm a 2-year member now. However, I was able to find myself progressing through districts, states, and then ultimately to ICDC, and that was an absolutely incredible experience, and I hope that we are able to share a similar one this year. So with regards to my, the goal of this video in particular, I would just like to explain how the day should go, so how you'll essentially see yourself progressing from prep time to competition time to exiting the room and what happens after, to essentially just talking over a brief role play, explaining how I might approach it myself. I won't be role playing, if you will, but I'll just be talking about the performance indicators and how I personally would respond to them. And then finally, I'll just add perhaps some extra tips or last minute advice, really. So with regards to this particular role play, I would just like to preface that my event is in fact apparel and accessory marketing. So as a result, it does tend to have a bit more of a creative flair than something like business finance or automotive services, anything like that. But I don't want there to be a misconception that the information in here is only pertinent to the apparel, because the strategies, I hope the strategies or the techniques that I talk about are equally useful or equally beneficial for those of you in the other individual series events. So I would just like to start off by saying that this particular role play is of the economic variety, and that when you're given this role play, I like to approach it by listing essentially by listing the judge, then who I am, then the performance indicators. And I try to be brief. I try to have incredibly brief buzzwords so that when you're looking down at your paper to reference your notes, you're not wasting time or there isn't an awkward lapse in eye contact. And then finally, my ultimate goal, I do tend to have down at the bottom. And I find that doing this just allows me to move swiftly through it. So in this particular situation, I also thought this roleplay was interesting for a number of reasons, not only because it was economic, but because the judge was someone that objectively had an inferior role in terms of levels of hierarchy, which, as they were a new employee, and myself, the role as the character, I do play the assistant manager, and so this person is essentially under me, and they're grading me, which I thought was a lot of fun, and I haven't seen that before. And so I thought this would be also a good opportunity to touch on respect and the fact that the level of authority that the judge's character has over you shouldn't really be shouldn't affect how you treat them. Ideally, you'll have the same amount of respect. You'll acknowledge them the same way, Mr., Mrs., etc. And that's incredibly important because that helps to create a professional business atmosphere, and that does tend to make you more likable, and which really is the goal here. You are trying to sell yourself. So this particular roleplay had 5 performance indicators, and it was based around the idea of selling shoes and how there was a given markup on the product. However, it was sold out immediately, and so we at the department store felt we were able to increase the markup, and then the demand, as the demand was so high, and we were also able to increase the supply. And so the way that the judge comes into this situation is that being a new employee, he or she wants to essentially find out more about the business world, and they're hoping to learn during their time here at this department store. So the first performance indicator is to explain the principles of supply and demand. Now, personally, this is a bit more of a definition question. However, you are able to show off a bit. So personally, I would start off just by defining what they are. So supply, how much of a market, how much of a product the market is able to offer, and then demand, the quantity of product that the market itself wants. So I would just define that, perhaps brief definitions, really. There's not too much to talk about here. You could also throw an example. So you could talk about, as we've seen in other situations, sold out goods, and you could just bring it into it, because just as an aside, I do find it incredibly beneficial to bring real world examples into this theoretical role play, just because it helps show the judges that you do have an understanding and you're able to connect this to more than just this particular world. So also in this situation, I did create a supply and demand curve graph. And so I know that we often talk about pest analysis or SWOT analyses, the Ansoff matrix perhaps. And those tend to be more of, you have to kind of finagle them really. You can just you tend to just create them to create them. But in this particular situation, I thought this lined up really well, and hopefully the judges would acknowledge that and appreciate the fact that you were able to utilize multiple methods perhaps to explain the performance indicator. So then the next one is of course to explain the concept of price. And so just again, I would start this off by defining what price is. So, how much it costs to purchase the good. And then I would perhaps, once again, you're able to show off here. And so, at least in the IB business book, we're given terms like penetration pricing, price skimming, cost plus pricing. And if you're able to name these, and there's a document, of course, with this terminology, it shows that you don't just know what price is. You understand it at a deeper level, and you realize that price can come in many different forms, and that it can affect the consumer in many different forms. For instance, penetration pricing, that just means you go really low perhaps, and that has its own market. Whereas price skimming, that's in tech, and so essentially you might price your product higher to recover some of the research costs, and then you'll see that your price will eventually go down low, as we see with iPhones today. So that's what I would do. I wouldn't spend very much time on it, as it's not a very complex idea. So next we have performance indicator 3. So at this point, ideally, you will be about 5 minutes through the role play, 4 to 5 minutes through it, just so that you're giving enough time to explain the other two, as I do think they're a bit more complex, and then you can do your overall goal. So then we see explain concept of private enterprise. This is incredibly, it's once again, it's really a definition answer. So you would just talk about the fact that it's a business owned by an independent entity, really, that's not related to the state or the government. And if you don't know what private enterprise is, don't worry. Just make sure that you know the difference between private and public, how those two work, the fact that private does tend to exist for a profit, and make sure that you can essentially what I'm trying to say is that you don't always need to know the definition of the word itself, or the phrase itself, as long as you know the root words. And so private enterprise, if you know the difference between public and private, as I mentioned earlier, you can make an estimated guess on what that means and hopefully get enough points to move on. So next, we have the fourth performance indicator, identify factors affecting a business's profit. Now here, this is a situation unlike the private enterprise where the only real situation where you can discern yourself is perhaps distinguishing between a company that is private or an organization that is private versus public. So you could talk about a company like Apple, Best Buy. In my situation being apparel, you could talk about Calvin Klein if you want. You can talk about the stores themselves, etc. So next, just coming back to the fourth performance indicator, identifying factors affecting a business's profit. You can just talk about them broadly, but the factors can be characterized into two different forms, internal and external. And if you're able to distinguish that and show the judge that you're aware of this, it can create a more professional atmosphere, and once again show them that you know the material well and not just at a surface level. So of course, in this situation, I would just explain between internal and external, and then also give an example. So perhaps internally, we might see a change in sales in the business, versus externally, we might see a change in the market stability, or perhaps natural factors. So for instance, an earthquake, a power outage, something like that, something out of the business's control. Finally, the fifth performance indicator, explaining concept of competition. Now here, it's just at a base level, just a rivalry between multiple businesses that are all selling a similar product or service. And then you could elaborate further on this. You could talk about perhaps Adidas versus Nike, And essentially, you can really bring that into all of these. You can make the presentation come to life and show that you're drawing from multiple sources of information. And ideally, you'll be able to just create a well-rounded presentation. So then finally, the overall goal of this was at the very end to present a presentation. So I won't be giving that just for the sake of time, but you would just be able to bring in all these performance indicators and hopefully weave them through the a presentation and essentially create something quite brief to help the employee understand how or not how, but why the price increase on these particular shoes makes sense by referring to supply, demand, profit, and competition. So that's about it regarding that particular role play. Other than that, some just last minute tips and tricks I'd like to give is go in there with a smile. Make sure that you start the role play and finish the role play professionally. The second that that judge sees you, you're in character, so act like it really. Make sure that you ask to take a seat, etc. Be incredibly courteous. And then with the time that you have left over, make sure to network, make sure to have friends, because at the end of the day, this is really for fun. So just see if you can make a few new friends at the conference. Thank you so much for watching.